Great Green Wall, the one in China, not the one meant to span the Sahel region, straddling the upper portion of Africa, is officially called the 3 North Shelter Forest Program, and was initially implemented by the Chinese government in 1978. This program is scheduled to be completed sometime mid-century, around 2050, and its purpose is to keep the Gobi Desert, which spans the lower portion of Mongolia and part of China's northern border, from expanding, which is something large deserts otherwise tend to do through a collection of natural but often human-amplified processes called aeolian desertification. The Gobi currently gobbles up about 1,400 square miles, which is about 3,600 square kilometers, of Chinese grassland every year, as dust storms that roll through the area blow away topsoil that allows grasses and other plants to survive. And those storms become more powerful as the climate shifts, and as more grassland is turned to desert, giving the winds more leeway, fewer things keeping them from blowing hard and scooping up more soil, and as the roots of the plants on the fringes of the desert begin to dry up, those roots usually keeping the soil in place. And as the desert expands, more areas are newly exposed to these influences, withering the tree's roots that then hold things together less tightly than before, and the process continues to move ever outward. Around a quarter of China's total landmass is already desert. And while there are a number of other causes of the country's desertification, including coastal erosion and the incursion of salty water into otherwise freshwater areas, this type, aeolian desertification, is the one that they can tackle somewhat directly, if still at great expense and with muddled levels of success. So the Great Green Wall of China is meant to stop that desertification. It is a potential means of tackling this issue, and it does this by keeping those winds from blowing away the topsoil, and over time is meant to help reclaim areas that have been turned into desert by this collection of processes previously. And those in charge of this program do this by basically planting a huge number of trees, creating sturdier root systems to keep soil from blowing away, blocking the winds, and over time, the trees are meant to help new ecosystems grow in areas that have previously been diminished, holding everything together soil-wise, but also adding nutrients to the ground as their leaves fall and degrade. Those natural processes slowly reestablishing new layers of productive soil. The area they are attempting to swathe with newly planted trees is huge, and by that 2050 end date, it is anticipated that they will need to plant something like 88 million acres of forests across a belt of land that's about 3,000 miles wide and nearly 900 miles deep in some areas. Local governments that have been largely tasked with making all of this happen in their jurisdictions have claimed some successes in this ambition over the years, though one of the biggest criticisms leveled against those same governments is that they often spend a lot of time and money planting large swaths of trees, stabilizing some areas for a time, but then they fail to maintain these forests, so they more or less disappear within just a couple of years. This can actually leave some of the afflicted areas worse off than they would have otherwise been, as many of these trees are essentially invasive species, not optimized for the local conditions, and they consume more water than is readily available, gobbling up resources that other plants need to spring up around them. And they thus blight the areas they are meant to enrich, killing off the smaller plant life rather than supporting and expanding it, and they then die because they are undernourished themselves. While China plants more trees than the rest of the world combined due to this and similar projects then, the system underpinning all of this planting is not typically optimized for long-term success, and it often succumbs to the needs of local politicians, not the desired outcomes of the program overall. Also, in the cases where the forests are sustained longer term, they often create monocultures that are more akin to plantations than forests, which makes them more susceptible to disease, like the one that killed more than 1 billion poplar trees that were planted in northwestern China in 2000, leading to a 20-year or so setback in this program. And that monoculture also makes them faster growing but less effective as carbon sinks than slower growth versions of the same. They get big faster, but they don't absorb and store as much CO2 as other tree options would. The forests they have planted that have sustained for more than a few years have periodically served as giant carbon sinks, though, pulling down as much as 5% of the country's total industrial CO2 emissions from 1978 to 2017, which is a pretty big deal for a country with such a huge volume of such emissions. That said, it's still an open question as to whether this Great Green Wall will do what it's meant to do by 2050 or ever, as while the concept is solid by some estimations, its implementation has been uneven at best, and it seems to be plagued by short-term thinking and metrics of success that don't line up with the stated purpose of the program. What I'd like to talk about today is the implementation of what's being called, in some economic circles at least, a new Great Green Wall, this one around China and its exports, especially renewable energy exports, placed there by the US and its allies at a moment in which these sorts of exports are both highly desirable and arguably highly necessary. You're listening to Let's Know Things. I'm Colin Wright. Learn more about Let's Know Things, subscribe to receive free email updates, and or become a supporter to receive monthly bonus episodes at letsknowthings.com. The International Energy Agency recently said it expects to see about $2 trillion worth of clean energy investments globally in 2024 alone. This spending is partly the consequence of the $13 billion in damage China sustained from natural disasters in January to June of this year, and the something like $37.9 billion in damages the US suffered from just the 15 most damaging storms it saw during that same period, not inclusive of all the other ones. Nations around the world are paying out gobs of money in the aftermath of increasingly brutal weather disasters, and that's on top of the slower-moving devastation that's being caused by the impacts of the climate shifting, messing with everything from crops to water cycles to where people can afford to live, because insurance companies are wholesale pulling out of some areas, and the cost of rebuilding over and over again in some previously habitable regions just isn't worth it anymore. While there's still some political and ideological opposition to the concept of climate change then, even some of the folks who are vehemently against the concept publicly are privately investing huge sums of money in infrastructure meant to help them survive and thrive in a future in which the climate has changed. And that includes things like seawalls and buildings that are cooler passively, allowing more airflow and reflecting sunlight rather than absorbing it. But we're also seeing surges of investment in renewable energy sources, as they do not further contribute to the issue of climate change, but also because they come with a slew of advantages over fossil fuel-based versions of the same. Hence, that $2 trillion clean energy spending in 2024 compared to the estimated $1 trillion for fossil fuel-based energy sources the same year. In May of 2024, US President Biden announced a near-future wave of tariff increases on a slew of Chinese goods, especially those related to the renewable energy transition. For those aforementioned reasons, alongside a bunch of economic ones, as renewables are cheaper over time than fossil fuels, it's expected by essentially everyone that the planet will largely shift to renewable energy sources this century, with many governments hoping to make the transition entirely or almost entirely by 2050, with some nations that are moving a bit more slowly because of issues related to existing infrastructure, to population, or to poverty, arriving sometime in the 2070s or 80s. Thus, whomever owns the industries that will be relevant in that future, electric vehicles, batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, and so on, they will be something like the new oil giants of the latter half of the century and beyond, massively enriched because they are the ones that allow everyone else to generate energy in this new reality. Making those sorts of investments now then, in terms of manufacturing capacity, but also the knowledge and trade secrets and brands and supply chains that get those products to the world, may yield incredible dividends for those willing to make such investments. And at the moment, as of mid-2024, China is by far the king of the hill when it comes to pretty much every component of this transition, dominating the world's output of solar panels and EVs and wind turbine blades and batteries, and even the rare earth metals that are currently fundamental to the making of basically all of these things, while also owning some of the most valuable intellectual property, developing some of the most vital innovations, and controlling the most active, resilient, and competitive supply chains that make all of this stuff available globally. The push by the Chinese government to own these spaces began in earnest in 2009, when it started providing subsidies to companies that were willing to invest in and start producing electric vehicles and accompanying technologies. And that successful effort has allowed the country to leapfrog other countries like the US, which by some measures had a leading advantage up until that point because of other capacities and investments, and which has long served as the home base of traditional car companies and exciting new startups and brands like Tesla that were beginning to gobble up global market share in some of these technologies. The Chinese government poured tens of billions of dollars into tax breaks and subsidies, though, and that helped stoke a highly competitive internal market that has led to the development of ultra-cheap electric vehicles, which are now outselling rivals in almost every market they've entered. This effect is perhaps even more pronounced when we look at solar panels and batteries. Chinese exports of these goods have easily outpaced and outcompeted rival producers overseas, and that, combined with demand on the local Chinese market, has pulled the price of solar panels from about $126 per watt in 1975 all the way down to about 26 cents per watt in 2022. Over that period, these panels have become more efficient and effective, more resilient, and more useful, more reshapeable to fit into more use cases. And the concomitant drop in lithium-ion battery prices, down by about 97% since 1991 due to similar economic variables, has made solar even more useful and in demand, as solar setups are usually, these days, connected to battery backup systems that allow the panels to capture sunlight during the day and to stockpile energy for later, when the sun is not shining, ameliorating one of the biggest and most common concerns about solar power at the individual home scale, but also at the utility, city-sized scale, that it is an intermittent source. Attaching a battery, though, makes it a consistent source of power that is also incredibly and increasingly inexpensive compared to other options offering similar levels of power. That's been a major contributor to the expansion of solar installations, and recent innovations in the development of alternative, non-lithium-based batteries could do the same, as some novel battery types, like sodium-ion batteries, use a similar setup as their lithium counterparts, but without the issues associated with mining lithium, and with a better power-to-weight ratio, much lower risk of fire, and lower theoretical expense. And like flow batteries, made from iron, salt, and water, which are a lot worse than lithium-ion batteries in essentially every practical regard, but they are just silly cheap and incredibly resilient, and thus could be built and deployed essentially everywhere, in the walls of homes and other buildings, into driveways and roads, pretty much everywhere, providing widespread low-grade energy backup to whole cities at a very low cost. So all of these products are already in high demand, and that demand is just expected to grow as these things continue to get better and cheaper. China owns the majority of the best companies in these spaces and makes the best, cheapest versions of these products. Biden's recently announced tariff increases are an example of what are called protectionist monetary policy, the idea being to make competing products from elsewhere, like China, more expensive by requiring folks pay another 25 to 100% of the product's price in tariffs, which in practice can sometimes as much as double the price of these goods, which in turn makes locally produced goods, or those produced in allied countries like European countries, more competitive, despite not actually being competitive one-to-one without these policies in place. The argument for this type of policy is that, while on some level it could be beneficial to have these high-quality, cheap Chinese solar panels and batteries flooding into the US market in the short term, as it would help companies shift to clean energy sources faster than would otherwise be possible, in the long term, it would allow China to own these spaces, killing off all US-based competition in these industries, which would make the US economy, and by association, all US businesses and people, and the US government, reliant on China and a constant flow of such goods from businesses they control. That would mean China would have a permanent whammy on the US because if they ever wanted to invade Taiwan, for instance, and keep the US off their back while they do it, they could just say, hey, let us do what we want, or we will stop sending you solar panels and batteries, and we will stop providing support for the ones you already have, which would devastate the United States, because that would be equivalent to what happened when OPEC stopped exporting oil to the US in the 1970s. It was brutal, and we've only become more reliant on cheap, abundant energy in the decades since. And that's on top of concerns that China, if it owned all of the infrastructure related to these technologies top to bottom, which they kind of do, they would also conceivably have all sorts of potential back doors into the US electrical grid, giving them the ability to shut things down or cause other sorts of havoc in the event of a conflict. So while these are kind of just theoretical concerns at the moment, the risks associated with becoming reliant on one country, and in this case one country run by an authoritarian government that is not the biggest fan of the US and its allies, controlling all aspects of a nation's energy capacity in that way, those risks are substantial enough that the US government seems to think that it's worth taking a hit in the short term to avoid that potential future. This situation, in which short-term loss is necessary to avoid long-term energy dominance by China, is arguably a problem of the US and other wealthy nations' own making. As again, China started wholeheartedly investing in these technologies back in 2009, and the US and Europe and other entities that are trying to play catch-up now did not make the same bet at the same scale. And that's a big part of why they are so far behind, scrambling to figure out how to catch up and how to avoid having all of their own solar and battery and EV companies killed off in the meantime. Some of these governments are doing what they can now to pick up the pace. Biden's Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Act, for instance, are shoring up these sorts of businesses and seeding potential next step technologies. But again, these and similar efforts are more than a decade behind the same in China, and the Chinese government often entangles itself more directly with Chinese businesses than Western governments are comfortable doing with their own versions of the same. So Chinese businesses have that additional entanglement-related leg up as well. There's an argument to be made then that while these tariffs in the US and otherwise are almost certainly at least a little bit performative for political purposes, and at least a little bit reactive in the sense that they attempt to reframe Chinese superiority within these spaces as somehow unfair, rather than the winnings associated with making different and ultimately better bets than other governments back in the day, there is an argument to be made that this is one of the only ways to prevent Chinese companies from killing off all their foreign competition, locking themselves in as the makers of solar panels and wind turbines and battery backup systems and electric vehicles, and more or less owning that component of the future, which, because of how fundamental electricity is already, and how much more fundamental it is becoming as more nations segue away from fossil fuels as primary energy sources, that means they would have a slew of adjacent industries in an economic headlock as well. Arguably, the whole of every economy on the planet. Attempts to label one side good and pure and the other a malicious economic actor may be just set dressing then. And the real story is how one side managed to lock in a true advantage for themselves, while their competitors are scrambling at the 11th hour to figure out a way to dilute that advantage and maybe grab something of the same for themselves. Biden's attempt here, and similar policies being presented elsewhere, especially in Europe, but we're seeing some protectionist ideas flutter to the surface in other nations as well, most of them aimed specifically at China, are meant to give competitors time to catch up. And many of them use a stick approach, increasing the price of these goods on foreign markets, while others are carrots, offering subsidies for locally made panels and EVs, for instance, but only if their key components are made in friendly countries. So Chinese-made vehicles do not benefit from these subsidies, but those manufactured elsewhere often do. Some businesses in tariffed areas are bypassing or attempting to bypass these concerns by making licensing deals with, for instance, Chinese battery giant CATL, which makes the world's best and cheapest batteries, and which US-based Ford and Tesla have been dealing with in ways that they all claim still work legally under this new policy system. Other countries like Brazil and Chile in South America, and Hungary and Germany in Europe have been making deals to attract Chinese foreign direct investment within their borders, basically having Chinese companies build offshoots in their territory so they can benefit from the additional job creation and local know-how. And in both cases, the idea is to dodge these policies, still benefiting from relationships with Chinese companies, but in ways that allow them to avoid the worst of those sticks, even if they don't always benefit, at least fully, from the carrots. China, for its part, has been investing in reinforcing its global supply chains against these sorts of tariffs for years, especially following former US President Trump's decision to begin disentangling the US and China when he was in office, which caught a lot of businesses and governments off guard at the time. In the years since, Chinese officials have been moving things around so that many of their supply chains end in third countries, before then heading to US and European markets, giving them backdoor access to those markets without suffering the full impact of those amplified tariffs. This is just a riff on an existing strategy, though, as China did the same with their solar panels back in the industry's relatively early days of the 2010s, rerouting their panels through Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam and Cambodia to avoid tariffs, which is part of why something like 80% of the US's solar panels still come from these countries today. They are Chinese panels in most of the ways that matter, but those buying and selling them can claim otherwise for tariff-dodging purposes. Now, China is developing the capacity to build their EVs in Mexico before then shipping them to tariff-defended countries around the world, including the US just to the north. And Chinese mined and refined rare earths, which are necessary components for batteries and other such technologies, are being mined in and diverted through a variety of different countries, their origins visible, but still obfuscated for legal, tariff-related purposes. The US and its allies are beginning to insist that other trade partners implement similar tariffs against China when it comes to these sorts of products. But results have been mixed on that front so far, and it could be that even though this sort of trade war stance has been ongoing for nearly a decade at this point, policies related to these increasingly vital goods will be what finally fractures the global economy into rival collections of supply chains and viable markets. Smaller countries in particular, forced to choose between dealing with the US and other Western nations on one hand, and China and its allies on the other. Of course, again, intensifying weather events and the changing climate is stressing a lot of infrastructure and causing a lot of damage globally, which is making the shift to renewables an increasingly pressing need. At some point, that need could strain or break existing relationships, depending on who ends up wielding the most leverage in this regard, and that in turn could contribute to the ongoing and substantial realignment we are seeing in the global world order that has determined how things work economically and legally and militarily for the better part of the past century. The book I'd like to recommend today is called Meet Me by the Fountain, An Inside History of the Mall by Alexandra Lange. This book is exactly what you think it's going to be. It is about the mall and the people behind the development of the modern concept of the mall and how malls came to look and feel the way that they look and feel, some of the thinking, the psychological thinking, the accessibility thinking, the marketing thinking behind the decisions that those early developers made, and what it is about malls of the kind that emerged in the United States in particular in the mid-20th century. What is it that makes them so different from other places of doing business and consumption that have existed in other parts of the world and the United States before that point? Lots of interesting stuff in this book. I learned a ton about this topic, and if any of that sounds interesting to you, consider picking up a copy of Meet Me by the Fountain by Alexandra Lange. You can subscribe to receive email updates, find show notes, and other such content, and support this show financially, receiving additional bonus episodes as a thank you at letsknowthings.com. Learn more about me and my work at Colin.io. Subscribe to my other news-focused podcast, One Sentence News, wherever you get your pods, or at onesentencenews.com. And say howdy on social media. I'm at Colin is my name on Instagram and Twitter, and Colin Wright on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Colin Wright, and I'll talk to you again next week.